The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. For most Western Christians, for the last few hundred years at least, the idea of death, bodily death, has been seen simply as the stepping stone into heaven or wherever it is we go after death, without any thought for what happens actually, according to the New Testament, in God's creation of new heavens and new earth. And so for many Christians, death has been seen as just a gateway into new life. And so it's not anything to worry about from that point of view, and we shouldn't be grieving over people who've died. So some people have taught. I remember going to funerals when I was a boy, and people who were being quite careful not to cry, not to weep, because whoever it was that had died had gone to a much better place. Well, the whole question of grief over death is something we may return to, but we have to remind ourselves that in the New Testament, death is the enemy. It is the last enemy, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is not a kind, gentle friend ready to usher us into the presence of God. It is the negation of all that is good in creation. It is the moment of chaos, of dissolution, of God saying we cannot allow the corruption that has been introduced into the world through sin and folly. We cannot allow that to have free room to go on. God will not forever endorse the people that we have made ourselves into. Paul says in Romans 8, the body is dead because of sin. Then he does say the spirit is life because of righteousness, but how that works out is a whole other story to which we will return. The point is this: we have so easily imagined that it's just death and then heaven, and then we've forgotten that actually death is the destruction of the good creation, and that God's ultimate purpose is the reconstruction of heaven and earth and the resurrection to a new body which will be able to inhabit that new heavens and new earth. The original creation then has to be seen as good but transient. When God made the world, he made it very good, as Genesis says, but it was a project. It was going somewhere. And God put into his creation the symbols and signs of what it would take for humans to be his partners in that project. But if they were to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God says, on the day that you do that, you will die. Now, people have said, but they did it and they didn't die that day, but that's simply a misunderstanding of the Hebrew idiom. On the day that you do it, it doesn't mean within the 24-hour period immediately following your eating. Rather, it means once you do that, then you have signed up to death, and that's what's going to happen. And so Genesis 5, which tells the story of Adam and Eve's descendants, has ringing like a great bell through that chapter. So-and-so did this, he lived so-and-so, and then he died, and he died, and he died. It's a way of saying God meant what he said, that there is no way of sliding round the edge of that curse of death. And death is a curse. It's the denial of the goodness of creation. And there are some, from time to time, we see in the Old Testament who try to say that they have made a covenant with death. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 28, where Isaiah denounces the people who say they have made a covenant with death. With Sheol we have an agreement. This is Isaiah 28, verse 15. And when the overwhelming scourge passes through, it won't come to us. We have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. In other words, humans try to fool themselves and try to fool one another that they can do a deal, that actually death isn't going to matter, that as some people have said death is nothing at all. There's a passage written by an old Anglican theologian from 100 years or more ago, which begins, death is nothing at all, I've just slipped into the next room. That is a lie. That's not what it's about. And actually the theologian in question went on in the next paragraph of the sermon to explain that that may be how it seems from time to time when someone you love has just died, but actually it is a terrible, a horrible thing, a matter of the rending of one's very heart. So death is the destruction of what is good. It's not just an easy passage. And the Old Testament does, however, have glimpses of a rescue from death, not a going to heaven, but rather in Psalm 16 there is a promise that God will not abandon us. He will not let us see corruption, a promise which remains in abeyance until many years later it is fulfilled in Jesus. And then the book of Acts picks that up and quotes Psalm 16 in relation to Jesus, who was raised from the dead, and then going on to the promise that one day all Jesus' people will be raised from the dead, not just going to heaven, which interestingly the New Testament does not hold out as the ultimate goal at all, but rather the new world in which death will have been defeated. That's the point of it all. So the little hints that you get in Hosea chapter 6, in Ezekiel 37, and then a bit more explicitly in Daniel chapter 12, one of the passages which the later rabbis loved to quote when they were talking about resurrection. These are hints that God will do something more, not just, well, after death God will look after you, though he will, that's promised as well, but that eventually there will be a new creation and that death itself will be overcome. This is all based on the belief that God is the creator who has promised to put all things right. If you take away the idea of God as the good creator, then maybe this present world is a mess. It's just a fudge as thrown together by the forces of nature by themselves, and it may be a good thing if we escape it. Many people believe that today. Or if you think, well, yes, it was a good place, but it doesn't look as though anything good can now come out of it. In other words, God is not going to put it right. If you believe that, then again, no need for resurrection. Death may, it turns out, have the last word. But if God is the good creator, and if he is the judge who has promised to set everything right, then resurrection will follow. Death will be defeated. This, of course, bursts out in the New Testament in a whole new way. Jesus' announcement of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, and Jesus pioneering the way of healing and hope throughout his short but powerful earthly career. These are ways of saying yes to life and no to death. So that even when Jesus weeps at the tomb of his friend Lazarus in John chapter 11, he weeps because death is cruel and nasty and mean. And Jesus can, even though Jesus knows that God the Father is going to overcome it in the case of Lazarus and then specifically in his own case, Jesus weeps because he sees the damage that death does to communities, to families, and so on. But out of all that, Jesus is announcing that something new is on the way. When one of Lazarus' sisters said to him, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, well, I know he will rise at the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection has come to life and is standing here talking to you. And so this is a way of saying death does not have the last word. And so resurrection is a way of talking about God's undoing of the destruction which death has brought about. And that, therefore, is also to do with forgiveness. Death comes because humans rebel against God. Resurrection and forgiveness go hand in hand. They are God's way of saying, I will make all things new. I will put everything right. And so in the New Testament, we can see that the idea of death is made into something which we can experience already in baptism. In Romans 6, Paul talks about dying with the Messiah and already rising with him, so that if you are a baptized and believing Christian, then there is a sense in which you have already passed from death to life. It's a fascinating promise which Jesus himself echoes in John 5, verse 24. If you are part of the Messiah's family, you will not come into judgment. You've already passed from death to life. So that after death, there is life with the Messiah in the temporary state, and then the fullness of resurrection life eventually. So there is, of course, a subsense in which, as all pastors know, when you are with somebody who is deeply sick and for whom the only way forward is through bodily death sometimes appears as a kindly friend, putting somebody, as we say rather crudely, out of their misery. Yes, that can be how it is. I have sat at the bedside of people who have died for whom it was, as it were, a blessed relief, a kind of a sigh of relief. But in the larger scale, that's not what was going on. Death is not a kindly friend. Death is the last enemy. And new heavens and new earth is God's defeat of death. We must not make the mistake of those in Isaiah 28 who thought they could make a covenant with death and say, it's all right, really. No, death is to be defeated. We must not make peace with it. It has been defeated by Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection. It will be defeated in the last day when God makes new heavens and new earth. And we are called in the present already to be people of life. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence.